Hello and welcome to the UN Global Compact Network Australia's Bite-Sized Learning on Oceans and Business, supporting ocean sustainability and climate action. My name is Sarah Day and I'm the Environment and Climate Change Coordinator here at the UN GCNA. The purpose of today's session is to enhance the awareness among Australian businesses of the relationship between oceans and climate change and demonstrate how businesses can contribute to sustainable oceans. We'll be hearing from Martha Selwyn, Manager for Oceans at the UN Global Compact, and Sam Elsom, Chief Executive Officer at Sea Forest. So let's jump right in. Over to you, Martha.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here today. My name is Martha. I'm a manager at UN Global Compact, and I'm really pleased to talk to you today about some of the work that we've been doing over the past few years on sustainable oceans. So before I get going, I just want to tell you a little bit about the work that we do at the Ocean Stewardship Coalition. So this is a coalition based at the UN Global Compact, and we convene over 100 stakeholders within this coalition, from governments, policy, and importantly, ocean companies. And by ocean companies, I mean shipping companies, offshore renewable wind companies, aquaculture and fisheries companies, and we convene these companies together to discuss how cross-sectoral collaboration can enable the ocean to meet, on the one hand, climate targets under the Paris Agreement, but also the wider sustainable development agenda. One of the core things we do at the Ocean Stewardship Coalition is we really promote a holistic and principle-based approach to sustainable oceans. And these are founded in our UN Global Compact Sustainable Ocean Principles, which I'm about to tell you more about. And importantly, one of the core things that we do at the coalition is we bring the voice of ocean companies and the private sector to important UN processes that are convened to talk about the ocean, in particular, the UN Ocean Conference, which is actually coming up in 4 weeks' time. So I'm going to speak to you today, as I said, about the work we do at the coalition with a strong focus on our sustainable ocean principles, because these really are the foundation for thinking about how to potentially integrate or discuss ocean sustainability as a company. And I'll also talk to you a little bit more about some of the other work that we're doing. But first, let's take a step back, because I imagine some of you are well versed in things relating to the ocean. And for some of you, this might be the sort of first time coming into a bit of contact about what we're talking about when we talk about ocean sustainability. So the reason back in 2019 that the UN Global Compact came up with a set of sustainable ocean principles was twofold. On the one hand, the ocean and the people of the ocean are facing a number of challenges. So if you look at the left here on this slide, I did a quick Google, because sometimes that's the most effective manner, and you can see what the top 10 ocean issues are. And these are pretty aligned with what they are in practice. So I think we've all come across and heard about plastic pollution entering the ocean. I hope we've all have some idea or have heard about the overexploitation of fishing resources. So a number of fish stocks are completely overfished now due to unsustainable fishing practices like bottom trawling. And we also have an ocean that is really suffering under climate change. That's both in terms of rising sea levels, but also ocean acidification that is caused by increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these are just some of the challenges that the ocean is facing. And just on the right, I wanted to add a couple more challenges into that mix. So on the one hand, what's really important, and I'm actually going to show you a slide to illustrate this, is that we have an increasingly busy ocean. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but we are seeing a stark rise in uses of the ocean. So for instance, looking at this graphic here, it's called the Blue Acceleration. It's from a fantastic paper by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. You'll see at the bottom, for instance, we see a stark increase in offshore wind farms, but also a stark increase in marine protected areas, cruise tourism, more traditional ocean users as such, the ocean users we're probably all thinking about off the top of our heads, like shipping and like aquaculture. So everything is increasing, everything is accelerating. So the importance of a principle-based approach to these new industries is increasingly vital and important. Another thing, and another huge challenge the ocean's facing, is a a lack of transparency. And that in turn is really leading to some human and labor rights abuses on our oceans and on our seas. During COVID-19, for instance, we saw a number of seafarers that were unable to get on and off ships. So once again, human labor rights is a challenge on the oceans. And another challenge, which isn't spoken about as much, is we don't actually know that much about the ocean. And a fact that always and continues to baffle me is that we actually know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the surface of the ocean. So only 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped. So lack of ocean science, lack of ocean knowledge is a challenge. And then one other thing to mention also, and this is why sessions like these are so important, is we have a general lack of ocean literacy in society. So a lack of knowledge also on a societal level about why the ocean is important and what some of the main challenges are that it's facing. But I don't just want to talk about the challenges and why the Sustainable Ocean Principles can help to potentially address some of these challenges. I also want to be a bit positive and talk about some of the solutions. Now, when it comes to the Sustainable Development Agenda, the ocean has its own SDG. We have SDG 14, which is right at the top there. And SDG 14 is really about conserving and protecting ocean ecosystems. It's about having more sustainable fisheries management. But there are a number of other sustainable development goals. In fact, all of the sustainable development goals, I've only just picked a couple of them here, that the ocean and sustainable oceans can contribute to. So just taking a couple of them on the screen. Zero hunger. So we've spoken about fisheries. Now, unsustainable fisheries, of course, might solve all hunger, but will cause another problem in terms of degraded ocean ecosystems. But we can fish sustainably. That is possible. We have sustainable aquaculture, sustainable fisheries management. And if we were to increase the amount of sustainable fisheries, we could produce 6 times the amount of food needed. And this could really help to support zero hunger. And that statistic comes from the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy and their paper on the ocean as a solution to climate change. I also want to obviously discuss jobs, decent growth, economic growth. These are really important. And as we've just seen, ocean industries are going to increase. Now, if they're going to increase in a sustainable manner, in a principle-based manner, this is a huge opportunity for decent work and also for economic growth. And once again, just maybe going back to the zero hunger SDG, we go to the left on no poverty. I think what's really important to mention is that sustainable fisheries, small-scale artisanal fisheries, this is a huge source of livelihoods for a number of communities living on our global coastline. And that's not just fisheries, but also tourism, marine tourism. This is a huge source of livelihoods and importance for a number of communities. Now, just to zoom in on SDG 13, I think this link between SDG 14 and SDG 13 is being increasingly recognized, and that's really important. And here I want to highlight just some of the ocean industries and how they can help and support mitigating climate change. And by that, of course, we mean reducing carbon emissions. So I've already mentioned quite a few of these industries, but it's also nice to visually see them represented. On the left at the top, we see international shipping, for instance. This is a huge industry transporting 90% of global trade. And at the moment, it's a relatively heavy pollutant. It contributes to around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a lot of new tech and development happening at this moment, which is moving towards greener shipping. So exploring new green fuels like hydrogen and ammonia. And if we manage to transition to this new green shipping industry, it will be by far the most sustainable and climate-friendly form of global trade. So I think that's really important to underscore. Of course, offshore wind, other ocean energies like wave and tidal energy, they are particularly important when it comes to the climate mitigation mix. And actually, we see a number of countries now, including Australia, really recognizing the importance of ocean-based energy and solutions like offshore wind. And then on the right, we're going to some of my favorite ocean ecosystems, namely things like mangroves and seaweed farming and seagrasses. Now, these are just absolutely fantastic ecosystems in many respects, because on the one hand, we're actually seeing that they sequester more carbon, 4 times more carbon actually than terrestrial forests. So when you think about booking a flight and carbon offsetting that is often presented, quite often that's in relation to terrestrial forests. But actually, wouldn't it be crazy to think about seaweed farming or mangroves? Because actually these sequester more carbon than trees and than terrestrial forests. But what's also really important about these, as we call them, ocean blue carbon systems, they're not just mitigating, they're also helping us adapt to climate change. So things like mangroves and seagrasses, they also really support resilient coastlines and support against things like extreme weather incidents that will increasingly happen as our climate changes. And of course, what's important to know is these are also win-win for nature, because these blue carbon ecosystems are not only sequestering carbon, supporting us to adapt to a new climate, but they are also regrowing and restoring our ocean biodiversity, and so tackling both our climate and nature crisis. I've already discussed fisheries, but just to say that while there are unsustainable fisheries practices, if done sustainably, and it is possible, and it is being done already, fisheries are a much lower source of protein than land-based sources.
Thanks, Martha. It's really useful to hear about some of the key ocean industries that have an impact on climate mitigation and the importance of ocean-based solutions. Before we hear more about the Sustainable Ocean Principles, I'd first like to hand over to Sam Elsom, CEO at Sea Forest, to provide us with some practical examples of how businesses are using oceans as a tool for climate action.
Sea Forest is a Tasmanian-based, science-driven environmental technology company producing a native seaweed-based livestock feed supplement, which, when fed in very small amounts to ruminants such as cows and sheep, virtually eliminates methane production. The company is 4 years old and is currently the only commercial supplier of this product to industry, and is pioneering the development of a new and environmentally positive seaweed industry for Australia, and in doing so, creating regional employment opportunities for Tasmanians. Ocean and climate are central to our business. The ocean plays an essential supporting role for our company. Our labs, our hatchery and land-based ponds all rely on a consistent supply of filtered seawater. Our marine farms too, where our seaweed grows on underwater structures, is reliant on the ambient flow and flux of nutrients and carbon abundant in the ocean. As a result of increasing carbon concentration in our atmosphere, our oceans have increased in acidity. By growing marine plants like seaweed, which photosynthesize, we're capturing the carbon and deacidifying the water. About 40% of the biomass which we harvest from the farm is carbon captured from the marine environment. But this impact is dwarfed by the feeding of a very small amount, just 10 kilograms of our sea feed product to livestock, where we abate 2.8 tonnes of CO2 equivalent from being produced by one cow in a year. We're now selling our product to major livestock companies and scaling our supply of sea feed to this year to wipe 1 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent from livestock production in Australia, and will continue to optimise our production methodologies to support greater impact on emissions reduction in the years to come. Ocean and climate are, unlike terrestrial farming, seaweed is understood to be a zero input crop, not relying on finite resources like fresh water or inputs such as fertilisers, pesticides, and have the co-benefits of creating habitat and shelter for marine life. We use science to understand and replicate the complex drivers for growth and reproduction of our native seaweeds, and work with the University of Tasmania, the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment to monitor changes in the natural biodiversity around our farm. In addition to farming seaweed, there have been other important environmental outcomes from our work. Around Tasmania, 95% of giant kelp forests have been wiped out. These giant kelp, Macrocystis, are the foundation species of our underwater ecosystems and have been classified as endangered. Last year, our science team turned their attention to the life cycle and propagation of the Macrocystis and provided the University of Tasmania 250,000 small propagules of kelp attached to little stones, which were planted out in a bay off the Tasman Peninsula, and which over a short period flourished into an underwater kelp forest. This year, we are working to scale the restoration work and pioneering a new frontier of conservation.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to hear how Sea Forest is developing ocean-based solutions for climate action. Now, back to Martha to talk to us about the UN Global Compact Sustainable Ocean Principles. Thanks, Martha.
So these are our Sustainable Ocean Principles. As mentioned, these were developed back in 2019 with over 300 stakeholders. So a really lengthy consultation process here. And they really do aim to give companies a framework for responsible business conduct on the ocean. So just to dive in, sorry, excuse the ocean pun there. When you look at them, you'll naturally see a lot of similarities with the UN Global Compact and Principles, and that is no surprise. They are heavily founded in our UN Global Compact 10 Principles, but they do differ slightly. And the reason they differ is because, as we've just looked, the challenges facing the ocean differ slightly. So our first 4 principles on ocean health and productivity, you can really think of these as the E of ESG as such. These are our environmental ocean principles. And here, for instance, we're looking at ways or calling on companies by committing to these principles to, for instance, consider business opportunities that may also restore or protect ocean health. To give an example, some ports, for instance, are actively restoring mangroves and seagrasses. So that's what we saw on the screen here, as part of their sustainable business growth. And by restoring these mangroves and seagrasses, they are also, of course, contributing to the resilience of that port. But they are also, of course, restoring and protecting that ocean ecosystem. Principle 3, I think we all could be relatively comfortable with, because here we're talking about, for instance, ocean-related companies or other companies using the oceans and reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So here, for instance, setting a science-based emission reduction target. And here, a number of particularly seafood companies and so aquaculture and fisheries are setting a science-based emission reduction target, so supporting their implementation of Principle 3. And what we're also increasingly seeing, and this is in terms of Principle 2 and 4, is that a number of ocean-related companies, particularly offshore wind developers, are setting net positive biodiversity targets. So actually creating ocean infrastructures that not only do no harm, but also have a positive impact on the ocean ecosystem. So those are our Principles 1 and 4 in a snapshot. Principles 5 and 7 are our government and engagement. And you can think of these as the G and S of ESG as such. And Principle 5 is really important because this is about responsible engagement with maritime planning authorities or other enforcement bodies. So here, to give an example, this would, for instance, be about, let's say, an offshore wind developer actively engaging with a maritime authority when it comes to determining how that offshore wind farm should be placed, and also not just engaging with that maritime authority, but also engaging with other ocean stakeholders like fisheries, aquaculture, to really think about how we use the spaces of the ocean, ensuring that stakeholder engagement processes is happening and it's inclusive. Principle 7, these are our social principles, and these are super important. I know I mentioned them in my slide previously, but ensuring that we have accountability on oceans, fisheries and shipping in particular, can sometimes be a bit of a human rights blind spot, both for the companies in question, but also the companies further along the supply chain. And I think what's important here is these principles, yes, they are relevant to companies directly using the ocean, like shipping, offshore wind, seafood, but these are also incredibly important and relevant to companies along the value chain. So companies, as I mentioned before, 90% of all trade goes via ships. So every company, or the large majority of companies, should be thinking about undertaking human rights due diligence on any kind of ocean-going activity that might be along their supply chain. The same, of course, goes for retailers. So, for instance, a number of retailers stock tuna or seafood. How do we make sure they're implementing Principle 7 and ensuring that the seafood that they're sourcing is also responsibly sourced? That's just to say these principles, yes, they are relevant to directly ocean-going companies, but this is also a really important framework for companies further along that value chain, like retailers, banks, etc., who can all use these as a framework and as a due diligence framework almost to assess how their business partners are acting on the ocean. And last but not least, Principle 8 and 9, these cover data and transparency. And this is quite interesting. And the reason it's interesting is because, as I mentioned, one of the core challenges facing the ocean is just a lack of knowledge. And ocean-going companies, shipping companies, offshore wind, they are constantly collecting data, some of which is non-commercially sensitive. So in what makes our sustainable ocean principles perhaps a bit different to other ESG principles that aren't related to the ocean is that we really see it as part of corporate social responsibility for ocean-related companies to share non-commercially sensitive data with scientific partners so that we can collectively grow our knowledge and expertise about the oceans. I wanted to flag also, and this is really important, is that yes, we're looking at these principles and they seem a little bit high level, and this is a lot of the feedback we got when we developed them. And these are all these are important framework and an aspirational framework, but what does this mean in practice? What does this mean if I'm a seaweed company? What does this mean if I'm an ocean renewable energy company? So what we've done is we've developed now a set of 7 what we call practical guidances, and these are available to all UN Global Compact participants. And what these guidances do is they look at every single principle and they lay out best practices for each of that principle. So we have at least 10 to 15 best practices under each of these principles, but also key partnerships and key resources. So these really help companies to actually implement the principles. And as said, we now have them for 7 industries. You see 3 on the screen now: shipyard, seaweed, and ocean renewable energy. But we also have them for aquaculture, shipping, and we'll also have one for ports coming up now. So I've spoken to you about our sustainable ocean principles, and this is really the sort of bedrock and foundation of what we do at the UN Global Compact Ocean Stewardship Coalition. So working with companies to really help them implement the sustainable ocean principles. But we also have 5 core issue areas and 5 core focus areas whereby we work in smaller groups with some companies to really take action and drive ambition on the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And these working groups are all founded in what we call our 5 tipping points for a healthy and productive ocean. Now you'll see these are very much a logical continuation from a number of the challenges and opportunities also outlined previously, and of course also integral into this in the Sustainable Ocean Principles. So on the one hand, we have a number of sustainable blue food working groups and also companies that we engage with around seafood and aquaculture. We also have a number of companies and stakeholders we particularly engage with around decarbonising shipping. As I mentioned, shipping can be a solution for the green transition, but only if we actually find ways to decarbonise this industry. We also have a number of companies and stakeholders that we work with on offshore wind, an industry, of course, I've mentioned previously, predominantly offshore wind, but of course it's not to say that wave energy and tidal energies also aren't part of this harnessing ocean electricity tipping point. End waste entering the ocean, once again, this is one of the challenges that I mentioned previously. So working with companies, both in terms of companies who might be plastic polluters, but also other kind of runoffs like agricultural runoffs. So really supporting that progress towards ending waste entering the ocean. And then, as I mentioned, mapping the ocean. So working with companies and other stakeholders to actually increase our knowledge about the ocean. So these are our 5 tipping points in which a lot of our UN Global Compact working groups are founded. And once again, these tipping points were devised and consulted with, and with at least 100 stakeholders. So this really is a global framework and recognition for some of the key areas that are important to address if we want to have a healthy and productive ocean.
Thanks, Martha. It's great to hear about some of the work that the Ocean Stewardship Coalition is doing at the moment. I just want to ask, how can Australian businesses work towards greater climate mitigation and adaptation through oceans?
I think this is really important because this will be an increasing ocean industry in the years to come in Australia. And for offshore wind developers, what will be really important is to ensure that that scale up of offshore wind or other ocean renewable energies is done in a way that does no harm to ocean ecosystems. So for instance, I mentioned exploring net positive biodiversity targets. So that's one thing, for instance, that we can talk about when it comes to sustainable offshore wind development. And then also, once again, using the principles as a framework, offshore wind developers can also engage with or ensure they are inclusively engaging with other stakeholders of the marine space. Of course, it's not just offshore wind that's playing a huge role in Australia today. Shipping companies are equally important. And here I've already mentioned a couple of things, but I think one of the key things that shipping companies or charterers in Australia can do is also, on the one hand, really look towards their climate targets. So that is things like exploring new green fuels, new green technologies. As mentioned, some of the fuels that shipping companies are exploring are around ammonia and hydrogen. And I actually believe there are one or two Australian shipping liners that are already looking into this. But what's important also is that exploration of new green technologies to green the Australian shipping industry is also done in a way that is done in consultation with relevant stakeholders, including seafarers and the workforce, etc. I've mentioned ports, and I think what's important here, and actually there's a lot of fantastic work being done, I believe, at the Port of Sydney, is around climate adaptation and climate resilience, and using the adaptation mechanisms and new infrastructure that we needed to make that port and make Australian ports climate resilient, to also foster other sustainable development goals. So I mentioned, for instance, how ports can work to restore local mangroves and ocean ecosystems while they are at the same time adapting to a new climate. I also mentioned aquaculture and fisheries, and there are a number of large aquaculture and fishing companies in Australia. And here, once again, some of the work that these companies can do is around using the principles as a framework, so setting a science-based emission reduction with the Science-Based Target Initiative, and then, of course, once again, ensuring or working towards more transparent seafood supply chains, which ensures that no workers along that supply chain are subjected to any human rights abuses. What's important, and I think I mentioned this previously, is that it's not just Australian ocean-related companies that have a role to play here. I mentioned the important role of retailers. So Australian retailers, and I know a number of them do have sustainable seafood sourcing policies, and this is really important. So ensuring that retailers also put demand on seafood companies to fish more sustainably and have more sustainable fishing practices. And of course, the same goes also for retailers, but also other high street brands or other companies, ensuring then that you're undertaking appropriate human rights due diligence and risk assessment mapping to ensure that, for instance, any workers along that ocean supply chain, so for instance, workers on ships or seafood vessels, are also being treated with respect and have your minimum decent work requirements. Another industry in Australia I also wanted to mention in this regard are banks and financiers. So we do see an increasing number of large banks really take up what we call blue finance. So same as green finance, but in relation to oceans. And here, once again, the sustainable ocean principles are actually being increasingly used as a foundation for sustainable financing in the ocean space. And as said, there are a number of blue bonds that are being developed, and these blue bonds are on the one hand supporting shipping to transition, but on the other hand, they're also supporting the implementation of more marine protected areas also, which is important. So I think in sum, there are ocean industries directly using the ocean in Australia, like offshore wind, aquaculture, ports, shipping, and that can use the sustainable ocean principles as a framework for their responsible business conduct. And a lot of great work is already happening in this space. But also companies further along the value chain, whether these be banks or retailers, high street brands, they also have a responsibility to undertake due diligence and use their leverage to to demand, in some cases, more sustainable ocean practices. And I think I will conclude by just mentioning that the Australian government is a member of what we call the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. So this is a panel that is chaired by the governments of Norway and Palau, and it consists out of 16 heads of state. And these 16 heads of state, they have committed to sustainable oceans and are really advocating for this on a global stage. So this is a really important opportunity for Australian companies and for Australia as a country to really begin converging and having some of these discussions with the high-level panel and also nationally about what a blue economy and sustainable ocean economy strategy will look like moving forward.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, Sam. It's been great to hear from you both today. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like any further information on how you can support sustainable oceans, please reach out to us here at the UN Global Compact Network Australia.